Do not move, boy. Turn around and keep your hands where I can see them." The words struck with cold precision. Officer Reed Callahan closed the distance in 3 steps and drove Zion Brooks's chest against the hood with a force that cut the air from his lungs. The metal burned his skin. The shock of the taser followed. His body folded. A second jolt tore through him before he could catch his breath. Callahan's fist landed next, sharp and deliberate, as Officer Grant Hollis blocked the Quick Mart door to keep anyone from stepping outside. Zion's voice cracked through the pain. His ribs tightened. His vision blurred. His dignity slipped away in the space between each blow. And in that short, brutal stretch of seconds, a quiet truth formed, certain and irreversible. What happened here tonight would destroy the men who believed they were untouchable. Before we continue this story, where are you watching from today? If you appreciate these true-to-life justice stories, subscribe to the channel and give this a like. Now we return to the moment that changed a city. Zion had finished a long evening practice, sweat drying on his jersey, mind set only on a cold drink before heading home. He never heard the patrol car roll up. Callahan stepped out first, posture rigid, hand already on his taser, insisting that Zion matched a robbery suspect. No robbery had been reported. Hollis circled the rear of the vehicle and announced that both body cameras had malfunctioned. The lie hung in the air without shame. Zion lifted his hands. He kept his voice steady. "Sir, I am just here for a drink." But Callahan had already made his decision. He seized Zion's wrist, twisted it backward, and slammed him against the hood again, firm and punishing. The sound echoed through the quiet lot, sharp enough to make Zion's heart skip. Pain spread through his shoulder. His breath trembled. Fear, the kind he had never known, settled deep inside him. Sofia Delgado sat in her car a few pumps away. She had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital. She saw Zion's hands up. She saw Callahan. Strike. Her instincts moved faster than her doubt. She raised her phone and pressed record. The lens framed the moment Callahan tased the boy again, sending him to his knees. Zion tried to speak, but his voice broke. The video captured his cry, thin and raw. "Mom, please." Those words would echo across millions of screens. But in that moment, they were heard only by the officers who caused them. Hollis tried to block the camera with his hand, shouting for Sofia to leave, but she refused to look away. Her voice trembled as she whispered to herself, "Not again." Callahan dragged Zion upright and shoved him into the back seat with a knee to the spine, as if trying to erase any last trace of this young man's humanity. Zion gasped. His chest tightened. His legs shook. He tasted blood. He closed his eyes, hoping the world would stop spinning. And still, neither officer paused. Neither officer questioned what they were doing. They believed they were safe behind the walls they had built for years. They had no idea those walls were already cracking. Sofia uploaded the 47-second clip. She did not add commentary. She did not add music. She posted it exactly as it happened. The cry, the blows, the taser flash, the disbelief in Zion's voice. The video began to spread in small circles first, then wider, then without control. It passed through group chats, church groups, activist networks, and late-night timelines. The first 1,000 views came in minutes. The first 100,000 came before the night ended. By the time the sun rose, the video had reached more than 2 million people and awakened a city that had grown tired of burying the truth. Inside the FBI's Chicago field office, Special Agent Nia Brooks sat alone at her desk. She often worked late. It kept her mind from drifting back to the night her own brother never came home. She rubbed her temples, reached for her coffee, and opened her phone out of habit. A notification blinked across the screen. Video from Oakwood Heights. She pressed it without thinking. The moment she heard the cry, her heart stopped. She knew that voice. She knew the breathless strain behind it. She knew the fear her son had never shown her before. She leaned closer to the screen, eyes locked on the shaking image. Callahan's fist, Zion's body folding, the taser flash, the blood on his jersey. Her hand trembled. Her breath faltered. A mother's instinct moved faster than any training she had ever received. The room seemed to tilt as she reached for her keys. She did not remember standing. She only remembered the sound of the door slamming behind her as she ran toward the parking garage. As Nia sped south on the Dan Ryan, the city lights blurred past her windshield. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Everything inside her narrowed to one truth. Her son was hurt. Her son was alone. And the officers who heard him believed they could bury the evidence like they had so many times before. She pressed harder on the accelerator. She knew Oakwood Heights. She had investigated complaints there. She knew about quiet settlements, missing footage, families too tired or terrified to keep fighting. But she had never imagined her own child would become another name in a silent line of victims spaced across 15 years. Not until she saw that video. The station came into view. She parked without aligning the wheels. She ran to the entrance. The desk sergeant hesitated when she flashed her badge, but one look at her face removed any doubt. Chief Malcolm Reeves emerged with a slow, practiced grin. He gestured toward the hallway with a courtesy that felt like a blade. "Your son resisted. Body cameras failed. He is fine." Nia walked past him without replying. She found the holding cell. Zion sat alone on the narrow bench, his jersey stained, his lip split, one eye swollen shut. He looked up, but he did not speak. Pain held his words hostage. She reached for him. He let her. And for the first time in her career, Nia felt her hand drift toward the holster at her side, not from duty, but from a mother's fury. She checked him quickly, her movement steady despite the storm inside her. She signed the paperwork with a cold, controlled hand and led him out of the building. He leaned against her, his steps uneven. She guided him into the car and closed the door gently, as if protecting the last fragile piece of him that the night had not taken. Later, after she had cleaned his wounds and settled him in bed, Nia opened the Internal Affairs database. She searched Callahan's name, then Hollis's. 5 young black men dead in, or shortly after Oakwood Heights custody in 6 years. 5 cases declared justified. 5 families dismissed or silenced. She sat back in her chair, heart heavy, breath steady, mind clear. The truth had been waiting for her, and now she had seen it. Nothing about this night would fade. Nothing about this night would be forgiven. And for the men who believed they would walk away untouched, their downfall had already begun. Nia drove through the night with a single purpose, her breath tight and steady as she replayed the video in her mind, each frame a wound that deepened with every mile. She reached the Oakwood Heights station, stepped out, and walked toward the entrance with a pace that held no hesitation. Officers inside turned as she entered, her FBI credentials held firm in her hand, her voice clear and controlled as she demanded her son. Chief Malcolm Reeves appeared with a practiced smile that carried an edge of mock sympathy. He spoke slowly, as if he believed gentle tones could hide the truth. He insisted that Zion had resisted, that both body cameras failed at the same moment, that the officers showed restraint, and that any bruises were unfortunate consequences of a necessary arrest. His smile faltered when Nia said nothing. She walked past him with quiet resolve, each step heavy with purpose. She reached the holding area and saw her son sitting on the bench, his shoulders hunched, his face swollen, his jersey marked with blood. The sight pierced her without warning, held her in place for a single breath, and pushed her forward in the next. Zion lifted his head as she approached, his one open eye struggling to focus, his voice barely above a whisper as he tried to stand. She knelt beside him and touched his cheek with a gentleness that steadied them both. His body trembled under her hand. She examined him with calm precision, noting the split lip, the bruised ribs, the tremor in his fingers. For a moment, she felt her hand drift toward her holster, not with the intent to draw, but with the instinctive urge to shield him from everything that had already happened. She pulled him close, helped him rise, and guided him past Reeves without a word. The chief watched them leave with a smirk that revealed his confidence in the system he controlled. But Nia did not look back. She knew that confidence came from years of buried complaints, frightened families, officers protected by silence, and a city councilman who traded justice for political loyalty. She placed Zion gently into the passenger seat and drove home without speaking, choosing silence over hollow reassurances that neither of them would believe. Inside the house, she cleaned his wounds with slow, steady care, each touch deliberate and respectful. Zion stared at the floor, avoiding her eyes, his breath shallow as he tried to describe what happened. His voice faltered. He stopped speaking altogether. He curled one hand into a fist and held it against his chest, as if the act might hold him together. Nia placed a blanket over him, her voice soft but firm, as she told him to rest. He nodded once and closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. She could hear his breathing change through the thin wall. Each uneven breath cut into her with quiet force. She knew trauma when she heard it. She recognized the early shape of nightmares. She knew he would never be the same after that night. And she knew nothing she said could erase what those officers had done. She sat beside his door for a moment, listening, steadying herself, letting the grief settle before she stood and returned to her desk. Nia opened her laptop, activated her secure credentials, and pulled the internal affairs records for Oakwood Heights. Her fingers moved with controlled urgency as she entered the names Callahan and Hollis. What she found tightened the air around her. 5 young black men in or shortly after custody, ages 16 to 23, injuries marked as self-inflicted, accidental, or medically unrelated. Despite photographs showing bruises in the same places she had found bruises on her own son. Closed investigations. No disciplinary actions. Repeated notations citing lack of evidence or officer statements consistent with department protocol. Her jaw tightened. She scrolled through older records tied to Chief Reeves, names she recognized from community meetings where parents wept without resolution. She saw families who begged for answers and received unanswered calls instead. She saw patterns that connected across 15 years, a cycle of violence wrapped in paperwork and hidden behind political favors. She opened her files from federal oversight programs, comparing budgets, reviewing grant reports, and studying complaint patterns. Oakwood Heights had been flagged twice in the last decade, but both times their leadership argued they lacked resources and needed more federal support. Money flowed. Oversight faded. Complaints multiplied. Nia leaned back and closed her eyes, the weight of the system pressing upon her. She had joined the Civil Rights Squad to prevent stories like this. Yet somehow, while she pursued cases across the region, one of the worst patterns had grown only miles from her home. The realization struck with equal parts guilt and clarity. She whispered to herself, steady and resolute. No more. When Zion woke, his breath caught in his throat as he tried to stand. She helped him sit, offering water, speaking with calm reassurance. He looked away, ashamed of his own pain, unsure how to face her. She placed her hand on his shoulder and told him he had done nothing wrong. His silence held more truth than either of them could express. She knew he carried not only the injuries, but the humiliation, the disbelief, the sense that a part of his safety had been taken from him forever. She told him she believed him. She told him she saw everything in that video. He looked at her then, eyes filled with conflict, and nodded once with slow determination. He trusted her, but he did not yet trust the world outside the door. Later, as she prepared soup in the kitchen, his hands began to shake. His spoon fell against the bowl. He closed his eyes and pressed his fists to his forehead. She called his name gently. He said nothing for several breaths. Then, with quiet shame, he whispered, "I do not want to go to school." The words broke something inside her. She told him he did not have to. She told him healing takes time. She told him she was here. He whispered again, "I thought I was going to die." She sat beside him and let the silence stretch, allowing his fear to settle without demanding he explain more. He leaned against her shoulder and stayed there until his breath steadied. That night, she sent him to stay with his aunt in Milwaukee. She packed his bag carefully, knowing distance might protect him for now. When she hugged him goodbye, he held her longer than usual, his arms tight around her waist. She kissed his forehead and told him she loved him. He whispered, "Come get me soon." She promised she would. She watched him leave with his aunt and waited until their car disappeared before she let her tears fall. When she returned inside, she locked every door, adjusted every blind, and opened her laptop again. She installed new security software, checked each camera feed, and placed her Glock beneath her pillow. She felt the house breathe differently. She felt the weight of truth settle in the air. She knew she stood at the beginning of something dangerous. She knew the system would resist her if she pushed too hard. She knew Reeves had friends in places where silence held value. Yet she also knew she carried something those men did not understand. She carried the truth. She carried a mother's resolve. And she carried the calm certainty that the men who touched her child had opened a door they could never close again. Nia returned from Milwaukee with a steady purpose and a silent house that felt heavier than it had ever felt before. She sat at her desk, reviewed the files she had already gathered, and realized she needed witnesses who carried history, not just documentation. She drove to St. Matthew Baptist Church and stepped into the basement office where Reverend Josiah Hale waited. He rose slowly, offered a gentle nod, and unlocked a steel cabinet with a key he kept close to his heart. Inside were folders marked by fading ink, names of young men whose families had cried in these very walls, statements never entered into official record, and complaints that went nowhere. He placed the first folder in her hands with deliberate care and said, "These should have been heard years ago." She opened them and saw stories that echoed her son's, the same language of resistance, the same sudden camera failures, the same bruises that matched standard compliance strikes. As she read, the truth spread through her with a quiet indignation that sharpened her resolve. She felt the weight of families who had stood alone. She felt the echo of a system that had dismissed them. She knew this was not one night of misconduct, but a chain that stretched across decades. Amara Cruz arrived with a stack of Freedom of Information Act documents and her laptop, her face pale but determined. She did not wait for greetings. She opened her files and showed Nia the numbers. Oakwood Heights, a small department, had somehow increased its budget while overall crime dropped. Grant funding surged. Expenditures did not match staffing levels. Audits were shallow. Reports inconsistent. The pattern was unmistakable. It pointed to a machine that fed on inflated statistics and unchecked authority. Amara spoke with calm precision, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that clung to her. She said, "This is not incompetence. This is intentional." Nia agreed, her breath slow, her words measured. Together they mapped timelines, compared witness statements, and layered the pieces like gears in a broken clock. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the department's leadership had built a system that rewarded violence and protected those who enforced it. Late one night, as Nia sat alone reviewing footage from community members who had sent clips directly to her, her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown number. 3 words appeared. "It is time." She recognized the tone, the urgency, and the risk behind the message. It belonged to Detective Theo Maddox, a man she had met only twice in her career but had heard about for years. He was known as a man of conscience trapped inside a department that punished conscience. She followed his instructions, drove to an empty parking garage on the edge of town, and parked beneath a flickering light that cast more shadow than clarity. She stepped out with measured caution, keeping one hand near her holster, but not on it. Maddox emerged from behind a pillar, his shoulders tense, his eyes hollowed by years of silence. He wore plain clothes, carried no badge, and held a disposable phone in one hand. He approached slowly, as though every step required courage he was still gathering. When he reached her, he looked down at the ground and spoke in a strained whisper. He said he had files, years of them, hidden copies of body cam footage that officers believed had been erased permanently. He said he had kept them out of fear and guilt. He said he had stayed silent because he had daughters who needed him home each night. His voice broke when he admitted he could not stay silent anymore. He handed her a flash drive with trembling fingers. The small piece of metal felt heavier than anything she had held in weeks. She asked what was on it. He swallowed hard and said, "Everything they buried." She did not speak. She placed the drive in her pocket, giving him the dignity of silence. Maddox lowered his head and whispered, "If something happens to me, do not let them say I agreed with any of this." She assured him she would protect him as far as the law allowed, but he shook his head gently, as though protection meant little to a man already marked by the system he served. When Nia returned home, she locked the doors, turned off the lights, and opened her laptop with care. She inserted the drive. Files appeared in a long list: dates, case numbers, incident codes, some she recognized from complaints she had reviewed earlier. She clicked the first video. The screen showed an officer pulling a 16-year-old boy into an alley, forcing him to the ground, and placing a plastic bag over his head until he gasped and confessed. The boy's voice cracked as he pleaded for air. Callahan's voice remained calm, almost casual, as he coached the confession line by line. Nia's breath stilled. She moved to the next file. It showed Hollis striking a man who was already handcuffed. Another showed Reeves in an office congratulating Callahan on a clean resolution. Another contained audio where officers joked about how easily the city dismissed complaints from certain neighborhoods. Nia paused the recordings only long enough to steady herself before continuing. Each file deepened the pattern she already knew existed. Each file told a story that had been denied to families who deserved answers. Amara joined her the next day, and together they watched every second, documenting each detail with precision. Reverend Josiah Hale sat nearby, his hands clasped, his face marked by sorrow, but not surprise. He had carried these stories for years. Seeing them confirmed did not weaken him. It gave him a renewed sense of duty. He told Nia that justice required both truth and courage, and that she now held both. Nia nodded, her expression solemn. She knew the road ahead would be dangerous. She knew Reeves and his allies would retaliate. She knew issuing a formal investigation would trigger alarms throughout the department. Yet she felt no hesitation. The truth demanded action. Maddox sent another message later that evening. It contained a warning. He said officers were growing suspicious. He said the chief had ordered an internal sweep for leaks. He said he might be placed on administrative leave soon. Nia read the message twice, absorbing the risk he faced. She replied with a simple acknowledgement and an offer of support. But he did not respond again. She understood why. Communication itself had become a risk. With the files now secured, Nia prepared a preliminary report for federal authorities outlining the severity of what she had uncovered. She included dates, names, and the video evidence that validated each claim. She worked through the night, her movement steady, her mind focused. She felt no uncertainty. She felt no hesitation. She knew she stood at a crossroads where her duty as a mother and her duty as an agent converged into one path. When she finished, she sat back and closed her eyes for a moment of quiet reflection. She knew the buried truth was now exposed. She knew those responsible would sense the walls closing in. She knew the hardest days were still ahead. But she also knew something else with unwavering clarity. Once the world saw what she had seen, nothing in Oakwood Heights would ever be the same again. The protests began quietly on a warm evening, the kind of evening when people stepped outside not to shout, but to stand together. By sunset, hundreds filled the street in front of the old municipal building, candles in one hand, phones in the other. They chanted Zion's name with solemn precision, each voice carrying both grief and resolve. Nia stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands resting at her sides, watching the community rise with a unity she had not witnessed in years. The first night remained peaceful, marked by prayer circles, soft hymns, and long lines of neighbors offering bottled water and whispered comfort. But beneath the calm, tension gathered like a quiet storm, waiting for the slightest force to set it loose. The second night brought that force. Out-of-town agitators slipped through the edges of the crowd with practiced ease, shouting provocations that clashed with the community's controlled grief. Police officers lined in military posture advanced without clear direction, shields raised, batons in hand. An object flew from somewhere Nia could not see. Officers surged forward. Tear gas filled the street. The air burned, and the people who had come to mourn found themselves running, choking, and shielding their children. The peaceful vigil transformed into a struggle for breath and space. Cars burned at the far end of the block. Helicopters circled low enough for their blades to rattle windows. Nia moved through this chaos with steady purpose, her instincts guiding her toward pockets of panic where people stumbled or froze. She called out over the roar of the crowd, her voice clear but urgent, telling them to move toward side streets, to stay low, to cover their faces. She had no authority here, but in moments of crisis, authority belonged to those who stayed calm. Amara Cruz stood on the roof of a nearby storefront, live streaming the eruption with the same courage she had shown for years. Her camera captured the volleys of tear gas, the officers advancing in tight formation, and the young protester who collapsed beside her, blood running down his temple from a rubber bullet strike. She filmed as she pressed a towel to his head, her voice breaking but unwavering as she narrated the moment. "The community came unarmed," she said. The response did not. More viewers joined every minute, drawn by the raw honesty of her footage. She stayed live for 9 straight hours, even after a canister landed near her foot and filled the air with choking smoke. When she finally climbed down from the roof, her face streaked with tear gas residue and blood from a small cut above her eyebrow, she pressed on. She interviewed mothers who had lost sight of their sons in the chaos. She filmed officers pushing against crowds that had nowhere left to move. She documented every misstep, every escalation, every plea for help. Her footage would later become part of a federal inquiry. But in that moment, it served a more urgent purpose. It kept the truth alive. Nia stepped into the heart of the crowd with a bullhorn and someone pressed into her hands. She spoke with measured force, her voice carrying above the noise. She told them they were not alone. She told them violence would not honor those harmed. She told them unity would reveal what chaos tried to conceal. Her voice steadied the front line. Protesters lowered bricks they had been poised to throw. Officers hesitated in mid-step for a brief moment. The street stilled under her words. She walked forward slowly, hands visible, shoulders squared, showing neither defiance nor surrender, only resolve. She spoke again, urging the officers to hold their line without advancing, reminding them that cameras watched and that escalation now would fracture a community already pushed to its limits. Her tone was calm but authoritative, the tone of someone who understood both justice and restraint. The officers paused. The crowd softened. The night held its breath. A fragile peace returned for a moment, held together by the strength of one woman who refused to let the city tear itself apart. She left the crowd only when she knew they were dispersing safely. When she returned home, she found her front door marked in red spray paint with the word "Rat." The letters dripped down the siding like a warning written in anger instead of ink. She stood still, absorbing the message with quiet clarity. Her training told her to call it in. Her instincts told her it came from someone within the department. She took a breath, walked inside, and closed the door behind her with controlled calm. She wiped the paint from the doorknob to prevent it from staining her hands, then turned on each light one by one, checking the windows, checking the back entrance, checking her alarm. She installed additional cameras with deliberate care, placing each one where it would capture the approach of anyone who believed intimidation could turn her from her path. When she finished, she moved through her silent home with the cautious grace of someone expecting danger at any moment. She removed her Glock from its safe, checked the chamber, and placed it beneath her pillow. She did not tremble. Fear had no place here. Determination filled its space. The night grew heavier as she sat at her desk, reviewing Maddox's files once more, cataloging each video, documenting each timestamp. The glow of the screen illuminated her face with steady resolve. She knew these nights would become more dangerous, and she knew the department's leadership would grow desperate. Power rarely yielded without force. She accepted that truth with calm clarity. She worked through the files until her eyes blurred, then rested for an hour before beginning again. She ate only when her hands began to shake from exhaustion. She drank water slowly, grounding herself. She kept her phone within reach, waiting for Maddox's next message, praying he remained safe. Each hour that passed without word deepened the urgency in her chest. Meanwhile, her decision to send Zion to Milwaukee proved necessary. He called her twice that night, his voice soft, each sentence slow and careful. He told her he had trouble sleeping. He told her he kept replaying the moment Callahan's fist struck his face. He told her he heard the taser in his dreams. She steadied him with quiet reassurance, reminding him he was safe, reminding him he was strong, reminding him healing took time. She did not mention the spray paint. She did not mention the helicopters. She did not mention the files that haunted her screen. She protected him from details that would only deepen his fear. By dawn, the city lay under a thin layer of smoke, the scent of burned rubber lingering in the air. National news vans lined the streets. Faith leaders gathered in emergency meetings. Parents kept their children home from school. The mayor issued a statement urging calm, but his words carried no conviction. The city felt a shift, not like a single moment, but like the slow turning of a wheel that had long been rusted in place. The people refused to return to silence. The department refused to acknowledge fault. And Nia, standing between these forces, understood the road ahead would demand more of her than she had ever given. She also knew she would give it. As the sun rose, she stepped onto her porch, saw the last trace of red paint on her siding, and made a quiet promise to herself. She whispered it with steady breath, each word carrying the weight of a mother's grief and an agent's oath. "You will not break this city, and you will not break my son." Then she returned inside, closed the door, and prepared for the next battle, knowing the fire that had begun would not extinguish until the truth stood in full daylight. The night began in silence, the kind of silence that settles only after a storm has taken everything it can. Nia walked into the basement of St. Matthew's Church with her laptop under her arm, the flash drive from Maddox secured in her pocket, and a resolve that felt sharper than anything she had carried before. Amara was already there, setting up lights and checking cables with practiced hands, her face still bearing the faint bruise from a rubber bullet, but her expression unwavering. Reverend Josiah Hale waited nearby, calm and steady, offering the space and the courage they needed. The old basement carried decades of whispered prayers, confessions, and comfort, and tonight it would carry the truth. Nia sat at the folding table, opened her laptop, and connected the drive. The files blinked onto the screen like a long hidden confession. She breathed once deeply, grounding herself before the world shifted again. Amara pressed the button that sent their live stream into every platform they could reach. The view counter began at 0. It would not remain there long. Nia began with the facts, her voice measured, her posture steady, her tone calm enough to command attention without raising it. She spoke about patterns, dates, and evidence. She spoke about the 5 young men whose deaths had been dismissed without scrutiny. She spoke about Zion. Her voice did not break. It did not waver. It held each word like a weight that demanded to be heard. Amara switched the screen to a split view showing Nia on one side and the folder of files on the other. Viewers climbed into the hundreds, then the thousands. They scrolled comments in real time, some angry, some stunned, many saying they had suspected but never seen confirmation. Nia opened the first video, the one showing the 16-year-old with the bag over his head. The air tightened as the boy's muffled pleas filled the basement. Viewers gasped. Comments surged. People begged her to stop the video. Others begged her to continue. Tears slipped silently down Reverend Josiah Hale's face. Nia let the footage run in full because editing would be another form of silence, and silence was what had built this system. Later, Amara switched to the suffocation video recorded years earlier, the one Maddox said kept him awake at night. Callahan's voice filled the stream, calm, deliberate, unshaken, as he instructed the boy to confess while pressing the bag tighter. The boy's hands clawed at the ground, seeking air that would not come. His voice cracked with terror. The sound felt like a wound. The comment section erupted. Viewers flooded the feed with shock, grief, outrage, disbelief. The count surged past 200,000, then 3, then 4. Phones buzzed across the country as people shared the link. Newsrooms picked it up. Activists stayed awake to push it further. Families who had buried sons without answers watched and wept. Officers across the region stopped pretending their secrets were safe. And while the video played, the basement door shook with sudden force. A crash echoed through the hallway. Amara's eyes widened, but she kept filming. Reverend Josiah Hale whispered a prayer under his breath. Nia did not turn her head. She kept her focus on the lens, speaking with calm authority to a nation that had finally opened its eyes. Heavy steps thundered down the stairs. The door burst open. Callahan's team rushed in, weapons drawn but not fired, shouting for them to shut everything down. The stream kept running. Cameras kept rolling. Millions kept watching. A young officer grabbed Nia's wrists, pulled them behind her, and snapped the cuffs into place with a force meant to silence. She did not resist. She stood tall, looked directly into Amara's camera, and spoke a single sentence that traveled farther than any report she had ever written. "They cannot kill the truth if all of us carry it." The officer tried to block the lens, but Amara angled the camera higher, focusing on Nia's steady face as the team dragged her backward toward the stairs. The comment section exploded. Screenshots multiplied. The quote burned across social media within minutes. Outside, sirens converged on the church. Neighbors poured from their houses with phones raised high. They filmed the officers leading Nia out in handcuffs. They filmed Callahan standing to the side, shouting orders with a face twisted by anger rather than authority. They filmed as Amara emerged, refusing to stop broadcasting even as officers shouted at her to leave the property. The live stream stayed active, shaky at times, but uninterrupted. When Nia was placed into the back of the patrol car, she lifted her chin slightly, offering not defiance, but clarity. She knew this moment mattered. She knew it would strike the final blow to a system built on shadows. She knew the country was watching. Within the hour, the clip became the most shared video in the nation. By the next morning, it reached every major network. Journalists called constitutional scholars, civil rights attorneys, and former federal prosecutors, all of whom expressed the same sentiment. Oakwood Heights could no longer police itself. By mid-morning, the Chicago field office received a directive from Washington demanding a full briefing. Phones rang without pause. Community leaders staged emergency press conferences. Clergy opened their doors to families seeking protection. Officers who had remained silent for years began sending anonymous messages, adding details they had been too afraid to voice. The mayor attempted to frame the night as a misunderstanding, but the footage contradicted him at every turn. Hours after the live stream ended, the Department of Justice announced a full pattern or practice investigation into the Oakwood Heights Police Department. The statement carried weight. It carried urgency. And it carried the unmistakable tone of the federal government preparing to dismantle a corrupted system piece by piece. Nia's words traveled across the country in captions, news crawls, and morning broadcasts. They became a rallying cry. They became a line spoken in classrooms, church pulpits, and town halls. They reminded a nation that truth becomes unstoppable when shared by many. And while Nia sat in a holding cell with her wrists still aching from the cuffs, she felt no regret. She had ignited a fire that would not be extinguished. She had lifted the final veil. She had pushed the truth into the light so forcefully that no one, not Callahan, not Reeves, not Bellini, not the officers who protected the system, could force it back into darkness. The fight had entered a new stage, and the city at last was awake. Dawn broke with a pale, subdued light, the kind that offered no comfort and no promise, only clarity. Federal vehicles lined the streets of Oakwood Heights before most residents woke. Their engines hummed with quiet purpose as agents stepped out in coordinated formation, each movement deliberate, each command crisp. The Department of Justice and the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility had arrived not for conversation, but for consequence. Nia stood among them, released from custody only hours earlier, her wrists still marked by the cuffs Callahan had tightened with unnecessary force. She carried no bitterness, only resolve. The live stream had made silence impossible. The government moved swiftly because the nation demanded it. The first team approached Chief Malcolm Reeves's home. He stepped onto his driveway in wrinkled pajamas, confusion etched into his face as he tried to maintain an air of control. That moment evaporated the instant agents presented the warrant and pulled his hands behind his back. His voice wavered as he insisted this was a misunderstanding, a political stunt, a smear campaign. But the agents did not argue. They did not respond. They followed procedure with calm precision. His neighbors watched from behind curtains, eyes wide, realizing the man who had boasted of keeping the community safe was now being escorted into a federal vehicle. Head lowered, facade shattered. Across town, another team arrived at Officer Reed Callahan's home. Callahan attempted to flee through the back door, a choice that confirmed everything the investigation had already revealed. He sprinted across the yard, his breath short, his steps frantic. But agents tackled him within seconds. His face hit the ground with a dull thud, his arms pinned behind him as he screamed about loyalty, about brotherhood, about lies he insisted had been fabricated. No one listened. His words carried no weight now. His violence had been recorded. His cruelty had been exposed. His authority was gone. Officer Grant Hollis, meanwhile, surrendered without resistance. When agents arrived, he stepped forward with trembling hands already raised, his voice barely held together as he whispered that he would cooperate. He asked if it was too late to tell the truth. One agent replied calmly that truth always matters, but consequences follow regardless. Hollis nodded, tears forming, understanding that cooperation was now his only path toward even limited redemption. The sweep continued with unyielding precision. Supervisory Special Agent Pierce Lang was taken into custody at the federal building, his betrayal laid bare. He stood stunned as agents read the charges, his once confident posture collapsing beneath the weight of disgrace. He tried to meet Nia's eyes as she entered the hallway, but she did not grant him that acknowledgement. His betrayal was not only professional, it was personal. He had undermined the very work she dedicated her life to. He had enabled the system that assaulted her son. His downfall felt necessary, not triumphant. Councilman Marco Bellini was arrested in his office. Stacks of falsified grant documents spread across his desk, evidence he never expected anyone to see. He attempted to negotiate, to threaten, to invoke political allies, but every avenue had closed. His influence, once broad, now narrowed to a single prison-bound trajectory. By midday, the scope of the investigation had become clear. 28 officers and officials faced charges ranging from civil rights violations to evidence tampering, obstruction, fraud, and homicide. 45 wrongful convictions were vacated. Case files long dismissed as resolved reopened with new urgency. Families who had carried grief for years received calls they never expected, calls acknowledging their pain, calls offering apologies, calls promising justice. Some cried, some stayed silent, some hung up, overwhelmed by emotions they could not yet process. Throughout the operation, Nia remained steady, not as an agent seeking victory, but as a mother standing in the place where duty and anguish converged. She followed each step with measured breath, knowing the system that tried to silence her had now collapsed under its own corruption. She watched as evidence was boxed, cataloged, and transported. She listened as agents briefed one another in calm, structured tones. She spoke only when necessary, choosing her words with precision, honoring the gravity of the moment. When Hollis provided testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence, he insisted on speaking to her. She agreed only because truth required hearing even from broken sources. Hollis confessed to actions he had participated in, cover-ups he had supported, and fear that had held him in place for years. He admitted that he had seen Zion as a threat because the department had trained him to. His voice cracked as he apologized. Nia listened. She neither forgave nor condemned. She simply recorded his words, knowing that justice must remain steady even when emotions surge. The trials unfolded in the months that followed, each one cutting deeper into the culture of corruption that had defined Oakwood Heights for decades. Chief Malcolm Reeves was convicted on charges that included fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. He received 14 years in federal prison. His pension was revoked. His wife filed for divorce. His legacy dissolved. Reed Callahan received 22 years for civil rights violations and murder charges from cases long buried. His courtroom outbursts led to additional sanctions, revealing a man who had relied on power to mask his brutality. He left the courtroom in handcuffs, shoulders slumped, no longer feared, no longer respected, no longer untouchable. Grant Hollis received 7 years after cooperating fully, his testimony becoming a central pillar of the case against Reeves and Callahan. He cried as the sentence was read, not out of injustice, but out of a broken understanding of what he had become. Supervisory Special Agent Pierce Lang received 5 years, his federal career permanently stripped, his reputation destroyed by the revelation of bribery and deliberate obstruction. Councilman Marco Bellini received 3 years for bribery and fraud, his political ambitions ending in handcuffs rather than applause. As each sentence was handed down, communities across Chicago gathered to watch. Churches held screenings. Schools paused lessons for discussions. Neighborhoods that had lived under the weight of misconduct finally exhaled. The legal victories did not erase the harms, but they acknowledged them, honored them, and confronted them with the force of accountability. Yet Nia understood something deeper. Accountability was not healing. It was only the opening of a door. In the quiet moments between court hearings, she visited Zion in Milwaukee. She sat with him as he studied, his posture determined but his eyes still shadowed by the trauma he carried. She listened as he spoke about nightmares, about flashes of memory, about the fear that still found him when he tried to sleep. She held his hand when his voice faltered. She reminded him gently that survival was not weakness, it was power. And he looked at her with a strength that mirrored her own. As the final verdicts were delivered, Nia stepped outside the courthouse and felt a moment of calm settle within her. The wind carried the faint sound of protesters celebrating, chanting for justice. She knew the victory was real. She also knew the scars would remain. Justice had arrived, but healing still waited, and the fight for accountability, truth, and reform was far from over. But for the first time since the night she watched her son cry out on a stranger's phone screen, she felt hope, not as a promise, but as a responsibility. She was ready to carry it forward. Seasons passed, each leaving its mark on the community that had once lived in fear of a uniform it could not trust. Oakwood Heights no longer resembled the place it had been when Zion's cry first echoed across millions of screens. The old police station, once a symbol of intimidation and silence, had been demolished. In its place stood the Zion Brooks Youth Justice Center, a name chosen not out of sentiment, but out of purpose. The center held classrooms where young people learned their rights, counseling rooms shaped for quiet healing, and open courts where basketballs echoed against the polished floor. It was a living reminder of what suffering could become when a community refused to break. Zion, now 19 and a freshman at Howard University Law, returned home for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He walked toward the crowd with a calm that had taken years to build. His steps steady, his shoulders upright, his breathing even. The bruises were gone. The nightmares had eased. But the memory remained, not as a wound, but as a direction. The applause that rose to greet him was gentle rather than loud, full of recognition, full of gratitude, full of shared understanding. Nia stood beside him, her hands folded in front of her, her posture reflecting both pride and the weight of all she had carried. She had been promoted to lead a new national FBI task force dedicated to police oversight, a role created in the wake of the Department of Justice investigation. She accepted the position not for honor, but for responsibility. She knew reform required constant vigilance, and she intended to give it the years it demanded. Her face softened as she watched her son approach the podium. Reverend Josiah Hale offered a prayer that spoke of endurance and truth. His voice carried the strength of someone who had witnessed decades of struggle, yet still believed deeply in the possibility of change. Amara Cruz stood near the front, her book The Cost of Silence tucked under her arm, its pages already studied in universities and journalism schools. She had written it with care, documenting not only the fall of a corrupt department, but the courage of those who refused to let the truth die. She nodded at Zion with a quiet smile as the crowd settled. Detective Theo Maddox stood near the stage as well, dressed in a simple suit, his posture humble, his hands clasped at his waist. He had testified before Congress earlier that year, revealing the internal mechanisms of corruption with an honesty that helped reshape federal guidelines on body camera retention and internal review protocols. His career in law enforcement had ended, but his life had begun anew. His daughters sat beside him, watching with quiet pride. When Zion stepped to the microphone, a hush passed over the crowd. He looked out at the faces in front of him, faces that carried history, burden, loss, resilience, and hope. He took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. His voice was soft at first, gentle in tone, shaped by months of healing and years of reflection. He thanked the community for standing with him. He thanked his mother for refusing to let fear dictate her choices. He thanked Amara for her courage, Reverend Josiah Hale for his guidance, and Maddox for breaking the silence that had cost so many their peace. Then he paused. He looked toward the newly painted mural on the far wall, a sweeping piece of art that captured the faces of the 5 young men who had not survived encounters with the old department. Their eyes were soft yet steady, watching over the center that now bore a vision of justice denied to them. Zion walked toward the mural slowly. The crowd remained silent. He raised his hand and placed his palm against the cool surface of the wall, touching the face of the youngest among them. His words came quietly, yet they carried with the force of a pledge. "We are not done yet." The stillness that followed his statement held a reverence deeper than applause. It was a moment that acknowledged pain without letting it define the future. Nia closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the truth of his words. She knew justice was never a single action, never a single case, never a single reform. It was a journey that demanded constant attention, constant courage, constant renewal. And she felt the weight of that responsibility with a clarity that steadied her. As the ceremony concluded, families stepped forward to honor the names that had become symbols of the investigation. Some left flowers beneath the mural. Some touched the wall lightly. Some stood in silence. The center's staff guided visitors through the new counseling rooms, the legal clinic, and the mentorship hall named after Reverend Josiah Hale. The air held a sense of healing, not complete, but genuine and growing. Nia walked beside Zion as they greeted neighbors, answered questions, and accepted embraces. She felt the quiet warmth of belonging, something she had nearly forgotten during the darkest nights of the investigation. Yet even in this moment of renewal, she understood the scars would remain. They were part of the story, part of the truth, part of the resolve that carried them forward. As the crowd dispersed, Zion returned to the mural one last time. The late afternoon sun cast a gentle light across the painted faces, giving them a quiet radiance. He stood there alone, his hands resting at his sides, his thoughts settled. He remembered the boy he had been on the night of the attack, confused, terrified, broken. He remembered the weight of the taser, the blow of Callahan's fist, the taste of blood in his mouth, and the sound of his own cry. He also remembered the moment he realized he had survived, not only the assault, but the fear that followed. He let the memory settle in his chest without anger, without shame, without despair. He understood that survival gave him purpose, and purpose gave him strength. The camera pulled back in the mind's eye, revealing the mural in full. Beneath the faces of the lost were painted words chosen after long discussion, words intended to speak across generations. This fight belongs to all of us. Keep filming. Keep speaking. Keep fighting. The message stood as a promise and a reminder. It called upon every witness, every citizen, every young person who entered the center to understand that justice was a shared responsibility. Zion stepped back, allowing the mural to fill his vision. The autumn wind brushed gently across his face, carrying the scent of change rather than fear. He whispered the closing line, his voice steady and clear. Justice is not the end. It is the beginning. The scene faded with quiet dignity, leaving behind not triumph, but truth, not closure, but commitment, not finality, but the enduring belief that every act of justice shapes the world that follows. And every voice raised against silence carries the weight of progress. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and share it so more people can hear the message. Your support helps keep these stories alive.